Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a look at an excerpt from thickshades.com. It's called A Warning to the Sheep and the Goats. And I think it's going to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, just from the title, you can tell the speaker is pretty passionate about getting their point across.
Yeah, no kidding. But right away, they start talking about sheep and goats like it's, the ultimate litmus test for Christians.
It is a classic biblical image,
Mhm.
but the way they apply it to modern behavior is it's what's really striking, I think.
Yeah, for sure. It's like you're either in or you're out. You're either a true believer or a fake.
Right, and for them, the big thing is having a testimony. Talking about being born again.
Yeah, like that's the proof you're a real sheep.
Exactly. It speaks to this specific theological idea in Christianity.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the idea that your conversion experience, that moment you feel like you've changed because of your faith, that's what really matters.
So, like, without that profound change, are you even a real Christian?
That's kind of what they seem to be suggesting.
Wow, that's a pretty high bar.
Right. I mean, how can you really know if someone's had that kind of internal transformation?
Yeah, you can't exactly see into someone's heart.
Exactly. Which is why I think they focus so much on outward actions versus, actual inward change.
Right. They're really critical of those goats who just go through the motions but haven't really changed on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do they say shows that inner transformation then? Like, how can you tell if someone's a sheep if you can't just look at what they do?
Well, they bring up this idea from the Bible, the fruits of the Spirit, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty long list.
Yeah, and the idea is that these qualities should be visible in a true believer's life because of their relationship with God.
So it's not just about going to church or following the rules.
Right, it's about cultivating these positive character traits.
Almost like a spiritual checklist.
Yeah, kind of, but it also raises some questions.
Yeah.
Like what about people who are trying to grow in their faith but still struggling with some of these things? Does that automatically make them a goat?
That's a good point. It
Yeah.
seems like this black and white thinking might not be so simple,
Yeah, exactly. Spiritual growth can be a process.
for sure. And that's what makes me think about this whole thing about judging others. I mean, they're condemning goats for being judgmental, especially towards misbehaving sheep.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension there.
Right. On one hand, they're saying you need to be able to tell the difference between real and fake Christians, but then they're also warning against being judgmental.
It is interesting.
How do you balance those two things?
That's a great question, and it reflects something I think a lot of religions struggle with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's that balance between holding strong beliefs and still being compassionate towards people who see things differently.
Especially people you think are wrong.
Right. It's like the speaker saying the line gets crossed when goats become self-righteous and hypocritical, focusing on everyone else's flaws but ignoring their own.
And of course, they bring up the Pharisees, those religious leaders in the Bible, always getting called out for being all about rules and rituals without any real love.
Right. They're drawing a direct line between the Pharisees and these modern-day goats who are all about appearances instead of real interchange and grace.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful comparison. It makes you think about how easy it is to judge other people, especially when you feel so sure you're right.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that none of us are perfect. We're all on a journey.
So true. And this speaker definitely sees that journey as urgent.
Oh, yeah.
They're calling out those goats, telling them to wake up, change their ways, find true faith before it's too late.
That sense of urgency, it's definitely connected to how they view salvation.
Right. Like you better get it right now or else.
Exactly. It's all about making the right choices because the consequences are eternal.
Wow. So in their view, there's this big difference between the sheep, those transformed believers trying to live good lives, and the goats who are all about appearances and judgment.
Yeah, they haven't had that interchange the speaker thinks is so important for true salvation.
This is all pretty intense, I gotta say,
Yeah.
but I do want to understand more about the beliefs behind this message. Like, what kind of Christianity is this?
That's a great question. And to answer that, we need to look at the different branches of Christianity and how they see things like salvation, grace, and the role of personal experience and faith.
Okay, so we're going even deeper.
Yeah, let's do it. So, as we keep looking at this sheep and goats thing, it's important to remember that this kind of language can be really divisive, even though it's from the Bible.
Yeah, it's definitely pretty strong. Like, do you think all Christians would agree with this take?
Well, not necessarily. I know in Christianity, there are all sorts of different beliefs about salvation and grace and how you're supposed to live out your faith. This excerpt seems to be coming from a specific perspective, one that really stresses personal responsibility, moral purity, and that clear division between the saved and the unsaved.
So, like, where does this perspective fit in with all the other Christian beliefs out there?
Well, the emphasis on having a personal conversion experience
Hmm.
and that strong separation between who's in and who's out, those are like the hallmarks of what a lot of people call evangelical Christianity.
Evangelical Christianity.
Yeah.
Okay, so, like, what's that all about?
So they usually put a lot of emphasis on the authority of the Bible, the importance of spreading the message, and a belief in a literal heaven and hell.
So, it's not just about sheep and goats as different ways of being Christian, it's about eternal consequences.
Exactly. The stakes are really high in this way of understanding Christianity. It's not just about living a good life here on earth. It's about making sure you go to heaven.
Intense. And that explains why the speaker is so urgent about it, right?
Exactly.
Mm.
It's this whole act now or it's too late kind of message.
But do you think that focus on personal transformation could ever be a bad thing?
That's a good question. You know, a lot of faiths encourage spiritual growth, but we have to remember that everyone's on their own journey, and we all mess up sometimes. This excerpt doesn't leave much room for that kind of nuance or the idea that growing spiritually takes time.
It seems like they're saying you're either perfect or you're doomed.
No, it
That's
can
it.
come across that way.
Yeah.
And what about that idea of not hanging out with goats? It almost sounds like they're saying to cut off anyone who doesn't believe the same things as you.
Yeah, that doesn't seem very loving.
Right. It can create an us versus them mentality, which makes it really hard to connect with people from different faiths or even people in the same faith who see things differently.
Doesn't sound very Christian to me.
It can go against the whole idea of loving your neighbor regardless of what they believe or do. But, you know, the speaker does talk about misbehaving sheep, so at least they recognize that even true believers can screw up.
Oh, that's interesting. So even within their strict sheep and goats categories, they
Yeah.
know people make mistakes.
Yeah, it suggests that even those considered saved can still be tempted in sin.
Makes sense. But then they say that God disciplines those misbehaving sheep because he loves them.
Right, exactly. It's like even when they mess up, they're still part of the flock.
Okay, so there's some grace there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Even within this system, where there are these clear lines, God's love is there for those who haven't quite figured things out yet.
So it's not all black and white.
Not entirely.
Yeah.
I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. It's not about agreeing with everything the speaker says, but using their ideas to think critically and reflect on our own beliefs.
Totally. So how does all this connect to how the speaker uses the Bible? I mean, they quote a bunch of passages to back up their points. Did those passages always match up with their interpretation?
Oh, now that's a great question. And it brings up something really fascinating, biblical interpretation.
What do you mean?
Well, you know, Christians believe the Bible is sacred, but there are tons of different ways to understand and apply its teachings.
Right, like even within Christianity, there are so many different denominations and interpretations.
Exactly. So we have to remember that the speaker is giving us one specific interpretation, one that fits with their theological framework. But there could be other valid ways to understand those same verses.
Like looking at a painting from different angles, you might see totally different things depending on where you're standing.
Exactly. And that's what makes the Bible so powerful. It can speak to people across cultures and time periods, offering different meanings and insights, depending on who's reading it and how they're approaching it.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear more about how this speaker uses these Bible verses. What's the first one they mention?
Well, they start with Matthew 7:21-23, where Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven."
Wow, that's a powerful verse.
It is.
And it totally supports their point about actions speaking louder than words.
Exactly. It's not enough to just say you have faith. True discipleship, according to this view, means making your will match up with God's will and actually living out your beliefs.
So it's got to be more than just talk.
Right. And then they go to Matthew 23:23, where Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for being all about the little details of the law while ignoring the bigger things like justice, mercy, and faithfulness.
That's a good one.
It is. And this passage is really important for understanding why this speaker is so against being judgmental and self-righteous. They're saying the true righteousness isn't about following every rule perfectly, but about having compassion, fairness, and humility.
Like sometimes we get so caught up in following the rules that we miss the whole point.
Exactly. And this struggle between sticking to the rules and showing grace is a big theme in the Bible and in Christian thought. It's that balance between following God's commands and knowing we're all flawed and need His mercy.
And then they bring up Hebrews 12:6 to 8, which
Yeah.
talks about God disciplining the people he loves.
Yes, that one's interesting. It suggests that even those who are considered sheep, the true followers of God, are going to face challenges and trials in their journey of faith.
So it's not about being perfect, but about letting God shape you, even when it's painful.
Exactly. It's the idea that sometimes we need to go through tough times to grow and mature in our faith, and that those tough times, those moments of discipline, can actually be a sign of God's love, not that he's abandoned us.
Wow, that's deep. It's like saying that sometimes the hardest things we go through are the ones that change us the most.
Right. And that brings us to another passage, is Romans 8:9. You, however, are not in the realm of the flesh, but are in the realm of the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God lives in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, they do not belong to Christ.
Okay, that one seems to get right to the heart of their whole sheep and goats thing.
Yeah, this passage goes to the core of their argument about how important it is to have the Holy Spirit within you as proof of being truly saved. In this view, the people who have the Spirit of Christ are the real believers, the ones who have changed from the inside out.
It's not enough to say the right things or do the right things. You have to have that inner change, that Holy Spirit living in you.
Exactly. And that interchange is supposed to show up in how you act in those fruits of the Spirit we talked about before. But even with these clear categories, the speaker does use a passage that seems to suggest a more balanced approach.
Which one is that?
It's Galatians 6:12, where Paul tells believers to gently help those who have wandered off track and to carry each other's burdens.
That does seem to go against what they were saying before about separating from goats.
It does.
Yeah.
It suggests that even within this system where there's a clear line between the saved and the unsaved, there's still a call to be compassionate and understanding and to help others who are struggling.
It's like they're saying, yes, there are differences between real Christians, those who aren't, but we should still treat everyone with love and realize that we're all human and mess up sometimes.
I think you've nailed it. There's this tension in the excerpt. On the one hand, the speaker is drawing a line in the sand between sheep and goats, emphasizing the need to tell them apart and even separate from the goats. But on the other hand, they're also saying grace and forgiveness are important, and that we should help others who might be struggling with their faith.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, and it leads to their final point, a statement that I think sums up their whole message. True salvation is found only in Christ, not in appearances or works.
That's a pretty powerful statement.
It is. And I think he cuts through all the complexity we've been talking about. He goes straight to what the speaker believes about faith and how we receive God's grace.
Like, it's not about what you do or how good you look. It's about accepting God's love and mercy through Christ.
Exactly. It's about surrendering to something dearer than yourself and trusting in God's grace.
So even though this excerpt uses strong language and might not speak to everyone, it does make you think about what it means to live a real and meaningful life.
Absolutely. And it makes us ask some big questions about faith, grace, and how we should treat people who believe different things.
We've covered a lot here. We've looked at that sheep and goats metaphor, the theology behind it, and how they use the Bible to back up their points.
And along the way, we've seen some interesting tensions and complexities that I think are worth thinking about more.
Definitely. It's not just about agreeing or disagreeing with everything the speaker says, but about really thinking it through and being open to different ideas.
That's what this deep dive is all about, helping you understand the material and making you think about these big questions about faith life and how we treat each other.
So are we ready for the last part of this deep dive?
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've gone through all the stuff about sheep and goats and the theology, all those Bible verses, but I still can't help but wonder, is it really that simple? Can you really just put everyone into one of those two boxes?
That's a really good question, and I think it's what makes this whole excerpt so interesting. It seems like a pretty black and white view of faith and being a good person, but I think there's actually more to it than that.
Really? How so?
Well, remember that part from Galatians about helping those who have strayed? It shows that they recognize that even the sheep can mess up. They can fall short and need help.
Right. So it's not about being perfect all the time.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
more about recognizing that we're all on a journey and we're going to make mistakes along the way.
I guess that's where the real challenge comes in for everyone, whether you agree with the speaker or not. It's about admitting you're not perfect, showing grace to others, and focusing on what really matters, like being loving and compassionate and humble and wanting to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's where people can find common ground, even if they have different beliefs. It's about trying to live with integrity, being kind to others, and being open to learning and growing.
And maybe by focusing on those things, we can start to overcome the stuff that divides us and create a more loving and understanding world.
That's a great thought.
Mm.
And I think it's a good place to wrap things up. This deep dive has taken us through some tough topics: faith, judgment, the human condition. It's a lot.
Yeah, it has. But in the end, I think it gives us hope. It reminds us that even though we're different, we can try to connect with each other on a deeper level and build a world where grace and compassion win out.
I like that. So with that, I think it's time to end this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.
Yeah, thanks for listening. We hope this conversation has made you think and inspired you to keep exploring these big questions.